friend that I am just excited to introduce you to. Many of you, if not all of you, know his prior work if you don't know him personally, but I want to introduce you to Saul Singer. Saul Singer, yes. I know you. So Saul and his co-author, Dan, they wrote this great book that you may have heard of called Startup Nation. You've heard of this book? I mean, like, seriously, like, how cool is it that everybody in the world now uses that term, Startup Nation, to talk about Israel? I don't know about you, but, you know, to be a person who coins a term, I think about like Joseph Heller and Catch-22, like to be able to be somebody that brilliant that coins a term of art that everybody in the world uses is pretty darn cool. So Saul, kol hakavod to you and Dan. His new book, yeah, let's give him more applause. Thank you. So the reason why we brought Saul out here today, though, is because he has a brand new book that has just come out, and it's called The Genius of Israel: The Surprising Resilience of a Divided Nation in a Turbulent World. How apropos for this moment, right? And Saul's got a great storied background. He used to be an editor at the Jerusalem Post. He's written all for Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, for so many publications. He's spoken all over the world. Before he made Aliyah in 1994, he was working for a decade on Capitol Hill. But now he and his wife, Wendy, and their 3 girls live in Jerusalem. And we are just so thrilled that Saul was able to schlep out here to be with us today. So Saul, thank you for being here. So first of all, Saul, tell us, how are you? How's your family? How are the girls? How's everyone holding up?
Yeah, so I feel like the standard answer for how are you is like everyone. We're lucky that, you know, nobody in our immediate family was directly affected, but we're all affected. And you know, our kids are 23, 25, 27 are girls, and they all know people who something's happened to them, including killed. And they've all been called up among the something like 360,000 reservists who've been called up. One of them was told that actually you shouldn't come with it because there are too many people here in the unit, because the you know, more people than were called showed up, and the other 2 are in and out of the of their, you know, service.
Nice. And you and Wendy are holding up okay? I know you're probably nervous, but you're doing all right?
Well, there is an advantage to girls in that respect. But actually, you know, we talking about my brothers, we have 11 cousins between us, and they're boys, and one of them is in a kind of commando unit. So, you know, every family has someone in, and some have 2 or 3 boys in, and but everyone's going through it at the same time, yeah, which helps.
Yeah, you have that camaraderie. All right, we're going to dive into your book. So there are cards in the back of the room when you walked in. If you are interested in asking Saul a question, you can grab a card, grab a pen, write it down, pass it to one of the team members, and they'll bring it to me, and you'll get to ask Saul a question as well. But I have a few prepared questions. And let's dive. First of all, I want us to understand what created the pivot. You went from Startup Nation to The Genius of Israel. What prompted you and Dan to take this pivot? Tell us what the book's all about.
So it really was about stumbling on some amazing statistics, some metrics about Israel that we didn't know, that we actually were surprised by. And they're about Israeli society. And, you know, Startup Nation was really about, in some ways, a book about Israeli society. And even we're so close to Israel, we hadn't really seen these things. And basically, for instance, you know, Israel has a higher life expectancy than, you know, than even the, you know, places like Sweden, the Nordic states, like the main European, about 4 years longer than the United States. Israel has, I mean, we have a problem of a sort of epidemic of loneliness here in the US. We have a problem of what's called deaths of despair, which was defined as, deaths from suicide or alcohol or drug abuse. And if you look at the OECD, the collection of rich countries, Israel has the lowest of that particular metric. And that's mind-blowing. And, so like something like a third of the Nordic countries, something like a quarter of the US, Germany, places like that. So, we started seeing that there's something going on here. And the biggest thing I would say is something that basically just violates the laws of demography, which is that basically the law of demography is as countries get richer, as they get more productive, they get less reproductive. Their fertility rates go down. And what's happened is every rich country has gone far below replacement, meaning the 2.1, which is the level that you have to be at to maintain your population. And Israel is the only rich country that hasn't gone down below that. And the implications of that are really kind of staggering. You have a kind of a global demographic crisis. You have basically if you have below replacement fertility rate, you don't have enough young people. So you're rapidly aging. And, Israel's median age is about 30. And it's projected to stay that more or less all the way through 2050. In Japan, it's going to be 55. So we're talking about a decade or more difference in age. And basically, Israel is young and growing, and the rest of the rich world is aging and shrinking. And that has tremendous implications for energy, for dynamism, for optimism, for how you feel about the future. I mean, in a way, the biggest bet on the future is having children.
Right.
And Israelis have, show their confidence in the future in many ways. They're also very optimistic.
Yeah.
So all these things were really striking us as extraordinary and needed explanation.
So before we get to the optimism and the happiness, because I want to talk about that too, but let's go back to the life expectancy thing, because it's not like it's a stress-free environment in Israel. It's not like they're not cooking with, mom's chicken schmaltz. So what do you attribute the longevity to in a country like Israel that is a high-stress environment?
So the reason why longevity was actually an important metric for us is because loneliness and unhappiness are actually unhealthy. There were studies that showed that loneliness can be the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day or something, crazy things like that. So in a way, it's not just a measure of physical health, it's a measure of the health of society. Because the Israeli health system is good, but it's not better than a lot of these other countries.
Right.
So the difference, we think, has to do with this societal health.
I love that. And you talk about the World Happiness Index in the book and where Israel ranked this past year, which may surprise everyone to know that Israel is the 4th happiest country in the world, which is just shocking when you think about it, right? It's not like Israelis are walking around with big smiles on their faces all day long. And you say that in the book. You're like, that's not really what we mean by happiness. So share what the Happiness Index actually means and why it works for Israelis.
So this happiness index is kind of a strange thing. The idea of comparing happiness of different countries is in some ways a little iffy, which is why we also like to look at the other side of the coin, the despair side, which we have, clear metrics. But it really is striking that you have in the top 10 countries, basically all the Nordic countries, and stuck there in the middle is Israel, above Sweden there somewhere. And but the interesting thing is they do ask an important question. They ask you, think about your life, and how satisfied are you with your life, 0 to 10? Imagine a ladder, 0 to 10. Where do you put yourself? And Israelis put themselves very high on that ladder. So it's not how happy are you now in the moment? It's more of a life satisfaction question. Now, that poll that it was based on was from before both this time of strife, the judicial reform, and before the war. So we'll have to see how it comes out, but I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't change that much, believe it or not.
Okay. So you mentioned the judicial reform piece, but the whole premise of your book, it was completed just before October 7th. So how does this crisis right now, how do you think that impacts the premise of resilience and happiness? And tell us a little bit about what's going to happen in this moment vis-a-vis that.
So the crazy thing about this book is that we were pretty much finished before the judicial reform crisis struck. We had time enough to take account for it, but we were kind of scrambling and say, here we are, this is a book about solidarity in Israel and all the secrets of that, and here's Israel just tearing itself apart. This is a problem for our book, not to mention the country. And then this war happens. And now we've seen Israel go from the depths of division to the heights of unity and solidarity. And suddenly, I think we have something that helps explain where that comes from. It doesn't come overnight. And it's not, and I have trouble kind of thinking how to explain this, but it's not like after 9/11, everybody comes together. There's a sense of unity. It's much more than that. It's everybody mobilizes. In fact, I interviewed a few tech CEOs for something we were writing, and one of them said, we're all in Sav Shmoneh. Sav Shmoneh is literally order number 8. It's an idea that every Israeli knows. It's basically when you're called up to reserves. That's called Sav Shmoneh. So everybody is either been called up into reserves literally or is in Sav Shmoneh in civilian terms. The whole country is mobilized, and it's amazing to see. And I actually hope, even at this time, that some of you get there. There's been some solidarity visits. It is possible to come, and it's a real amazing thing to see.
So one of the things you've talked about is this notion of coming together as a country, this notion of unity, the sense of community and belonging, and that being the antidote to loneliness in many ways. I don't know if you even know, but the U.S. Surgeon General has said that there's a loneliness epidemic in this country. And some countries have, I think the UK has a loneliness minister, and others have happiness ministers, right? It's a crazy thing to think about, but you recognize. So can you give us some examples of how Israel is able to combat this sense of loneliness? What is it that creates this sense of community, this sense of belonging, and how can some of that stuff be exported to America, for example? Yeah,
very important. And basically, Israelis, as they're growing up, are socialized to think, it's not just about you. And that's a critical thing, this idea of service and also the idea of the group. Mm-hmm. There's something bigger than you. And it starts very early. It starts in youth movements. It even starts in the classroom. There's this crazy thing in Israel, which is if a classroom is not migubash, which means kind of unified or crystallized, literally, cohesive. If your class, your home class, is not cohesive, then the teacher feels like they're a failure. The kids feel like it's a bad, the kids complain, the parents are upset. And, what is a classroom? I mean, that's not even a thing in America, to be unified. But in Israel, it's everything. So, that's starting, and then it just keeps increasing until you get to the military. Mm. And that's the ultimate. And in some ways, the culture is preparing you for the fact that you're in the military, your life can depend on, and that everything is the unit, the mission and the unit. You cannot accomplish the mission by yourself. Right. And you have to be unified. And this idea of the group is so central to Israeli culture, and that's a big part of it.
So how do they accomplish this? I mean, Israeli society seems pretty divided between political left and political right, Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis and Bedouins and Druze. And you've got, of course, the ultra-Orthodox and the secular, the Tel Avivniks, the Yerushalmis. Like, how does Israel, is it all about just coming together in the military and this Israeli salad of people? How do they do it leading up to the military?
So one person, a friend of mine we interviewed, said basically that what you want is a situation where no one's happy, which means, which is ironic, but by that he meant that you have all these major groups that are kind of struggling they have different visions of the country. And you can't please everyone. And if someone's too happy about their vision actually being adopted, then someone's not. And Israel, by all rights, shouldn't even be a democracy. The idea that a democracy could survive under the circumstances of Israel, not just the threat and all that, but the diversity is incredible. Yossi Klein Halevi calls it a kind of laboratory of democracy under adversity. And that's what it is. And you could say that the protests or the whole crisis was a kind of example of that getting out of whack.
Yeah. You tell the story in the book of an image that became one of the hallmark images of the judicial reform protests, where some of the anti-judicial reform protesters were in Tel Aviv and the pro were in Jerusalem, and they all wind up at the train station with the anti going up the escalator and the pro going down the escalator, and they've got their posters and their shirts, and all of a sudden they start reaching over and high-fiving and shaking each other's hands. And you tell the story, and it became an image that struck the national news. What strikes us in this country is that somebody who loves Trump and somebody who hates Trump can't even sit at the same table. So what are your lessons for us in this country? It seems like the stakes here are not even always as high as the stakes in Israel, and yet Israelis get this inherently. What lessons can Americans learn from Israelis in this case?
So one interesting thing to note is if you look at the protest movement, which I don't want to call left and right because it really is the center of Israel, was very patriotic, is very patriotic. Its symbol was the Israeli flag. And normally, you think of flag-waving people, it's more people on the right, right? And this was a protest where sort of anti-government protest with a sea of Israeli flags. And Mika Goodman points out that usually the more passionate and larger a protest is, the more violent it gets, and the more it gets to be against the country. This protest was nonviolent and patriotic. And that is that's an Israeli, Mika calls it an Israeli startup.
Israeli startup for sure. Yeah, it's a pretty special thing. One of the other things that you talk about in the book is this notion of how Israelis can be so openly divided and fight and argue with loved ones and perfect strangers. And you gave some examples, and it reminded me of a story about when my wife's family, Israeli, we were going to a family kibbutz for a family wedding, and it was up in the middle of nowhere north, and we're driving around and we get lost, and my brother-in-law Mike has the guts to pull over the car and ask for directions. So good for you, Mike, because most men don't do that anyway. But in Israel, of all places, pulls over, asks for directions, and this woman starts berating him. You're an idiot. You're so far off. You have no idea where you are. What the hell's the matter with you, right? Typical Israeli, like, he doesn't know this woman. She's yelling at him, and he's like, can you help me? And she's like, give me your phone. She takes his phone, and she leads us to where we need to go, which is like 40 minutes out of her way, because that's what Israelis do, right? They have this notion of like leaning over and helping a perfect stranger. Again, I'm trying to find from you the secret sauce that we can import here to America, because we can really use a little bit more loving and healing and bringing together the disparate. So maybe share a story and an example of how we can bring this love.
Yeah, so that reminds me of a story we tell in the book. In fact, the book opens with the story of a guy named Joe McCormick, who's from Scotland. And he follows his Israeli girlfriend to Israel. And he's describing what it's like to be in Israel when the siren goes off for Yom HaZikaron or for Holocaust Memorial Day. He happened to be on a train, and the train was not anywhere near a station. The siren goes off, the train stops, everybody stands up, and it just blew him away. And this idea that everyone at one moment is doing the same thing and thinking the same kind of thoughts is really, in a way, it gets to your question about how is it that Israelis can be so divided and yet so united? And it's that kind of underlying reservoir of commonality that does it. That acts kind of as guardrails. Everybody knows at some level that if we let this get out of control, we're finished. And that's a big difference than anywhere else.
Yeah.
So he has this experience. And then, he's, in Israel and he's driving around and there's a little kind of, a bus cuts off a motorcycle. And the motorcycle starts banging on the bus. The motorcycle rider takes off his helmet, starts yelling at the driver, and they're going at it. And Joe is thinking, well, this is not going to end well.
Right.
And suddenly the motorcycle guy asks the bus driver for directions. And he gives him directions, said, thanks, and takes off. And it's like, what just happened? So,
Yeah.
and that's Israel.
A Scottish guy can't possibly understand that, unless it's Barry Finestone, a Scottish Jew, who we all know. But yeah, that's Israel. This notion that you said of this reservoir of communality, how do we create that here? Is it time, Saul, for us to kind of have this American national service, this requirement here, like they have in Israel? What do you think?
So, yeah. So Israel has a culture of service, and there's a huge contrast. In a way, if you think about the trajectory of Israelis compared to the trajectory of, let's say, elites in America or anywhere else, you basically have, what do you have on the horizon? You have in the US, you have the university getting into that school, and that's kind of a one against all process. And the Israeli has the military. And the military, it's all about working as a team, and it's about service to something larger than yourself, which creates a very different dynamic. So the ideal of service, yes, if you can inculcate that in Americans. And the good news is that there is a consensus, a bipartisan consensus in the United States about national service. It just doesn't happen. Right. But there is, in theory, there's a consensus around this. And I think it is the biggest takeaway from the book, something that can be done. Because if you take the words military service, you can keep the word service. It doesn't have to be military.
Right.
It can be any kind of service.
Right.
And that's a good start.
Sure.
I would also just point to the Mechina model. I don't know how many of you have heard of Mechinot. All three of our daughters went to one, and two of them are now counselors in different ones. And what they are is a gap year program after high school, before the Army. These kids, usually 40, 50, live together. They study together. They volunteer together. They study kind of Zionism and Jewish philosophy and all these things that they never could talk about in school. And they have an amazing time, and they come out, much more together. But also it kind of inculcates, again, this idea of service. It's a way of socializing people for being together, for solidarity, for community, for service.
We love this idea here of the Mechina program. The gap year program, or what we call the leap year, which is an acronym that stands for learning, experience, action, and peoplehood.
Excellent.
And our notion is, and we've done this for the last 3 years with the help of Gary and Kathy Rayant, to experiment. How do we take American Jewish kids, actually diaspora Jewish kids, how do we send them off to Israel with Israelis on a Mechinah program, so it's also a relationship they have together? How do we bring them back here for a diaspora experience? My daughter last year was on a program like this, Young Judea Year course. Young Judea is here in the audience with us, but there's a number of different organizations that are doing this now. This could be the future. This could be the way we can change how young people have true relationships with each other.
I think that the Mechinah model works everywhere. In fact, they're actually doing it. They're Mechinot in Ukraine that were started before the war, and that's a whole story. But the formula works everywhere. I think it can be adapted to anywhere, and I think it's the perfect thing for the American Jewish community.
I love that. I think we are in agreement, so let's hope it takes off. In the meantime, I wanted to get your take, Saul, on how this current moment and your thesis on resilience, how it changes American Jews' relationship with Israel, and what the future can look like from your perspective.
So something simple happened. One thing that keeps Israelis together is that they're all in the same boat. And now you're in that boat. We're all in that boat. And I think what we now feel and we now know is that we all have a part to play. And that if Israel is not strong, if Israel is not what it needs to be in the world in terms of accepted in the world and successful, and I think actually what we're arguing in some ways a model in terms of society, a society that works in the modern world. If Israel is not that, with your help, then that's a problem for everyone. But also that we need you, because something dangerous happened here, many dangerous things, but a particular thing which is that President Biden, thank God for what he did. If he had said half of what he said, we would have been happy. Instead, President Biden turned out to be like a cross between Churchill and Rambo, and it was like unbelievable. And I think, what a fluke it is that we have a president of that generation who can see things so clearly, good and bad. I mean, when is that going to happen again? But he sent aircraft carriers, and that's great for Israel, except for this. We were happy and we needed them. And that's a bit of a shock, because we've never needed anybody else. But we were very grateful for those aircraft carriers. And we need another kind of aircraft carrier that's just made of words. And that is, we need the United States to say something very simple. And it sounds almost technical. We need the United States to say, Hamas is responsible for all the civilian casualties on both sides. Now, why is that like an aircraft carrier? The simple words. Because the whole Hamas theory of victory is to turn Israel into a pariah state and separate Israel and the United States. That's it. Yeah. And they have this brilliant situation, which is the more you attack Israel, the more Israel is blamed. It's like, it all started when you hit me back. That's their argument.
Right.
And we have to break that cycle. And the only way to break that cycle is not with pictures of beheaded babies. The issue is who's responsible for the civilian deaths on the Palestinian side. And it can't be both Hamas and Israel. It's one or the other. And if it's Israel, Israel is the pariah state, and we're in big danger. If it's Hamas, then Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran are the pariahs.
That's right.
And so there's basically, in terms of a policy, I'm thinking like a Hill staffer. The policy language is very important. So the mantra now is Israel has a right to defend itself. Right. That's not enough anymore. The next stage of that is to say Hamas is responsible for all civilian deaths on both sides. And if anybody's kind of uncomfortable with that, because it says, that Israel's perfect, doesn't ever make a mistake, that's not what it's saying. All it's saying is that, first of all, Hamas started the war. Second, it's human shields. But worse than that, of course, their goal, and they're killing Palestinians themselves who are trying to move south. Their goal is more Palestinian death. It's not a mistake. It's not a bug. It's a feature, as they say in Silicon Valley.
Amen. I think we can all get behind that message. That's our aircraft carrier. That's our way to be the soldiers. Okay, it looks like we have some questions that have been written from cards. All right, thank you. All right, I'm going to go through these, Saul. No pride of authorship here, so here we go. How does the Orthodox and Arab birth rate, which brings down the average age, impact the idea of the optimism of youth in Israel in the coming years? And apparently some version of this question was asked 10 times, according to this note.
Oh, okay.
So a few people might want to know.
Okay, so let's say the OECD average fertility rate is about 1.6. In Israel, it's double that, about 3. And people say, oh, well, that's the Haredim. And that's actually not right, because any of you who know Israelis, who know, Tel Aviv, the normal number of kids is 3. And if you have 4, that's like extra credit.
Right.
Yeah. So it's and that's secular, bourgeois Tel Aviv, not Haredim. So the Arab birth rate actually was very high, but it's converged because the Arabs are more like normal people demographically. As they get wealthier, they have fewer kids, and their birth rate is now more or less like the Jews. It's not like the Haredim, it's like the rest of Israel's population. So.
Okay, thank you. Who or what should help with Israel literacy around the world?
Literacy in what way?
Learning about Israel history, the Arab-Israeli conflict. Who or what should be responsible for it? How do we do it?
Well, I think what we've all noticed now in the context of this crisis is that a lot of people who didn't think about it before suddenly realize they don't know how to respond to all kinds of things. And so we do need to be literate about Israel. And by the way, just while we're on kind of responding to things, this idea that Israel doesn't have a right to exist is a very sanitized thing, because what it basically means is that Israel should be destroyed.
Right.
There's no other way for it not to exist. And what that means is we have a little taste of it now in this massacre. For a few hours, we now know what it's like if Israel doesn't exist. So if someone says that Israel doesn't have a right to exist, I take that personally. My family, everyone in Israel, it's basically a genocidal statement.
Right.
I'm sorry, it is.
You don't have to apologize.
People have to realize that it's not an argument about colonialism and all that. the right to exist is about, are you for destroying Israel or not?
Right. And when you have marches and protests where the slogan is from the river to the sea, we know that means from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River. That's all of Israel. That's not arguing for a two-state solution. That's arguing for a no more Israel. And how do we make that clear to those out there who really just don't know? They're maybe the useful idiots, to use that term, that are kind of like, oh, I'm pro-Palestinian and I'm going to join this march because I feel bad that innocent Palestinians are dying, and they're marching alongside somebody that's calling for the genocide of the Jewish people. How do we teach them that they're being misled?
So there are two things. First of all, I think we shouldn't, there's a danger of spending too much time focusing on the people who hate us, who can't be convinced otherwise. Meanwhile, there's a huge group of people that love us and make us uncomfortable. And instead of embracing them and working with them together, we just ignore them, or they make us uncomfortable. But they love us, and we need allies, and we should be working with them.
You're talking about the evangelical Christians?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then I'm talking about a broad swath in the middle that's very open-minded, doesn't really know, much more than where the Middle East is. Joe McCormick thought that Yasser Arafat was president of Israel. Before he met this Israeli girl. So people are ignorant, and that's okay. It's like, how much do we know about the Houthis and the Tutsis and the Irish and we don't know about anybody else's struggles, and most people are like that. We think everybody knows about the Arab-Israeli conflict. They don't, but they're open-minded, and they're inclined towards us, and we need to educate them. Yeah.
That's a great point. I remember you and I both got our start in politics back in the day, and we used to talk about how there are saints, sinners, and salvageables, right? The saints are always with you, 10% of the population. The salvageables are the middle, 80%. The sinners are always going to be against you. And we get hung up by trying to address the sinners because they're the most vocal. But we should really be addressing that 60 to 80% in the middle that don't know who the president of Israel is or where Gaza is or what it looks like, because they're the ones that we can convince. So it takes discipline, though, and it takes time.
But on that question, if you were forced to talk to someone who, maybe someone in your family is part of this group, I think it's important to understand that there is the extreme left, and there is the extreme right, and there is a lot of convergence between them. Both of them hate, and both of them hate based on identity. It's about the color of your skin or whatever identity it is. Like for the right wing, Jews aren't white enough. Right. And for the left wing, we're too white.
Right.
But either way, it's the color. And that's wrong, because what you want, the problem is liberal democracy. I mean, the basic idea, whether you're conservative or liberal, it doesn't matter, but there's this concept of liberal democracy that we're all supposed to believe in. And the people who are out of that consensus need to be fought. And we know that we need to fight the right wing, so we have to feel that way towards the extreme left, because they're just as dangerous. And the extreme left needs to think for a moment and think, why am I on the same side as the extreme right? If there's an Israel protest, the extreme left would be standing on the same side as the Ku Klux Klan and the white supremacists. Isn't there something wrong there?
Something wrong there, absolutely. We've always talked for a long time amongst my friends here that it's not a political spectrum, it's a political circle. And the far ends actually reach each other. Exactly. Because it's a fascist tendency of not wanting to coexist with anyone who sees the world differently from you. And they both kind of merge at the end. Okay, in a remaining minute here, I'm going to ask you one last question from this stack that I have here, Saul. What one takeaway do you have for our audience today? One takeaway from your book, one takeaway from this moment. What do you want this group to leave here with today?
Well, I do think it gets back to a secret to living, a secret to the modern world, which is that humans are not meant to be alone. And we need to build societies we need to combat the natural tendency of modern life to move more and more towards individualism. There's nothing to balance it anymore. And the secret of Israeli society is this balance, and actually the Jewish people. We quote Jonathan Sachs, who asked Paul Johnson, the historian who wrote the book, The History of the Jews. Sachs asked Johnson, so, you wrote this, what's your big takeaway? And his big takeaway was that the Jews somehow found a balance between individualism and collectivism or group or community. And that's a magical thing. And Israelis have built on that. And so, actually, I want to just read you a quote from a guy named Sebastian Junger. And we use this. He says, he's an author who talks a lot about war, and he's a war correspondent, and he's studied the kind of bonds that happen there and compared to civilian society. And he says, humans don't mind hardship. In fact, they thrive on it. What they mind is not feeling necessary. Modern society has perfected the art of making people not feel necessary. So Israelis feel necessary. They feel like they belong to something. And now more than ever. So that's my message.
And I would make the case that if we broaden that, Jewish peoplehood ensures that all of us are necessary. We're all a part of this family, and that's why we're all here today, and that's why we're going to continue this fight. So thank you, Saul, for being with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. Pick up his book, The Genius of Israel. Thank you, Saul.